Um, Doug in Richmond, thank you, Doug. Would you consider Abraham Lincoln or Thomas Jefferson to be the closest to America's philosopher king?
Oh, I like that question. I would put Jefferson up there for all of notwithstanding some problems. Yeah, certainly I'd put Jefferson up there, but I might put John Adams up there too. As a great thinker. Of course, you'd have to put Alexander Hamilton and James Madison.
I was thinking Hamilton.
Yeah,
of course, the king part of that question got.
Yeah, the king is a little.
Yeah, Hamilton could have been that.
Yeah, statesman.
John, formerly from Ann Arbor and now in South Carolina, asks, I was always fascinated by Lincoln's philosophy of how public sentiment was everything. Can you expound on how this theory came into his handling of the timeline of eradicating slavery?
Well, Lincoln, that's a wonderful quote, and I mention it in the book. Public sentiment is everything in this country. He who tries to affect policies without public sentiment cannot succeed. With it, you cannot fail. Now, it's important, though, that Lincoln believed that public sentiment had to be ennobled. Public sentiment was not infallible. We know that Lincoln could be highly critical of tyranny of the majority and mobocracy and sentiments that were wrong. So the task is to ennoble, to elevate public sentiment in support of the Emancipation Proclamation. And that was a difficult task, right? I mean, given the racism in the country, given that you had war Democrats who were hostile towards black freedom. They were willing to fight for the sake of the Union, but not so willing to fight for the sake of black freedom. So Lincoln had to have a broad coalition on board to defeat the Confederacy and to extend the principle of equality, and that meant informing public opinion, elevating it, and ennobling it.
Well, let's talk about his rhetoric a moment. You talk a great deal about it, and certainly that was essential to his leadership style. And there's no better rhetoric, I think, in the use of rhetoric for political and social change than the second inaugural, where he says, among other things, the dogmas of the past are inadequate to the stormy present. We cannot escape history. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of earth. Explain
that's
his
from
rhetoric
that's actually from the message to Congress.
the mission of Congress.
Yeah,
Yes, that's right. Thank you.
Sorry.
A neuron didn't go off.
No. Fine. Today, rhetoric, I think it's a bad name. You know, it was revered by the ancients. Rhetoric, I think, unfortunately, gets identified with propaganda. Mm-hmm. And when we think of rhetoric, we think of just spin, one-sided information. Here, I mean, rhetoric is public persuasion, but I distinguish, and Aristotle distinguish between noble forms of persuasion and base forms of persuasion. Lincoln accused or viewed secessionist doctrines as sophistry. He himself used the term sophistry to describe the twisting of truth. Mm-hmm. Okay, the verbal manipulation for self-interest. The term with demagoguery too was used at the time in the 19th century to describe someone who played upon the passions, the base passions and emotions of the people. If you look at Lincoln's rhetoric, it's elevated with religious symbolism, with religious imagery, but it's also a rational rhetoric that appeals to the heart as well as the head through the power of language, and it really elicits, I think, the better angels of our nature.
He was certainly a thinker, and a deep thinker for that matter. He said that he listened when he was a kid. He'd listen to the elders speaking about whatever, and he'd go to his bed area, and he would try to bind it north and south, yes, bind it east and west until he could understand it, and then be able to actually use it and explain it to others. Metaphor was one of his areas. You tell the snake story, which is a wonderful little story. Why don't you tell us about his use of the metaphor with the snake?
I want to do both. I want to mention something that you just did because I think it's worth elaborating upon. Lincoln is a philosopher, statesman. Well, the mark of someone who is preoccupied, right, with trying to understand something, that passion, right? Where does that come from? Some people have it, some people don't. Some people spend hours and hours trying to understand something for its own sake, truth for its own sake, and also for its utility. And so you see Lincoln in describing this, I think, is in describing himself in this experience of wondering and of trying to understand and of spending an inordinate amount of time trying to articulate things is the mark of a thoughtful person, a philosophical person, and to be able, the gift of being able to explain that. Mm-hmm. Some people don't have that gift either. The other point you said is the use of metaphor, right, and rhetoric, public persuasion, the means of public persuasion. And Lincoln sought to make a very important legal distinction between territorial slavery, which, according to Lincoln, the Republican Party under the Constitution, could be restricted by the federal government, and state slavery, slavery that already existed in the slave states, which, according to Lincoln and the Republican Party, was off limits to the federal government. The federal government could not forcibly abolish slavery where it existed in the states prior to the circumstances of war. So how do you make this distinction to the public? Well, Lincoln said there's a vast difference between a snake in a child's bed and a snake in a prairie, a snake in a field. He said, if I see a snake in the child's bed, I'm going to be very careful about how I go about attacking that snake, because I might harm the child. I might also provoke the snake into biting the child. And of course, the snake in the bed with the child is a metaphor for the Union. Mm-hmm. And it's also a metaphor for slavery in the states where it already existed, and to deal with it carefully. On the other hand, there's a vast difference between that and a snake in a field, mm-hmm. where it's much easier to kill the snake, and we need not fear the damage that it would do to the children. There's no children in a cradle there. And then he says
in real estate, location.
He said it would be, in fact, by killing the snake in the field, one would be doing a great benefit. Lincoln makes it clear where he stands. And of course, to liken, slavery, whether it's state slavery or territorial slavery, as a snake, the symbol of evil in Scripture, is very telling. So you deal with it as a necessary evil.
There are people in your book, by the way, also, and here we have, and one of them was James Hammond. Now, it just so happens that we have his brother. I don't know how to show this too easily, but I'll try to keep it still for you, Bjorn. That is a surgeon in the Union Army. Both of them, John and James Hammond, were from South Carolina, but John went up to Philadelphia and earned his doctor's degree and became a physician, obstetrician even, and then went in from James Polk all the way through Arthur. He was in the Army as a surgeon or assistant surgeon, whatever. But his brother was James Hammond, who comes into your book, who was the one who coined the term "cotton is king." So Hammond in South Carolina, James, had strong views on free labor, and so did Lincoln. And tell us of how Lincoln had words, quote unquote, with Hammond's ideas.
Yeah, part of Lincoln's as a philosopher, statesman, involves his vision of free labor and how that was related to his vision of free society. Those two were interconnected. Lincoln had scorn for both pro-slavery philosophy, pro-slavery theology, and what was known as Hammond articulated it, the mudsill theory of labor, that there was a class that was permanently fixed in any society, some underclass to perform menial labor. And Hammond, profoundly and provocatively accused the North of having a mudsill. These were wage slaves, as he called it. So he would say, look, the Northerners need not be self-righteous. If you look at the conditions of laborers in the North, they're in fact worse than the conditions of African-American slaves in the South, who are paternalistically cared for by benevolent masters, and this is seen as an extension of the family, okay? Whereas in the North, it's much less personable, and these wage slaves are subject to the heartless changes of the free market. And this was part of the speech he made where Cotton is king. It's a very triumphalist speech that I would encourage people to read. Fascinating. And Lincoln's theories of free labor, in part, were articulated in response to this. He was outraged. Lincoln believed that there need not be a permanent conflict between labor and capital. He saw labor as prior to capital and a free society based on social mobility and the possibility of hope and social mobility.
We have another question. Mike from Genesco. I'm glad all of our listeners are actually thinking today and letting us know what their thoughts are. Could you speak to how both Lincoln and pro-slavery individuals cited the same Bible to defend their positions? One often hears about the Bible basis for abolitionism, but not so much about the biblical defense of slavery.
Yes, my first book.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. My first book, Abraham Lincoln's Political Faith, looks at this in great detail, and I do mention it in this book here. It's important as part of Lincoln's vision. It's crucial to understand that the Bible was invoked on both sides, and the South would invoke passages, servants from St. Paul, servants be faithful to your masters with fear and trembling. The South would invoke the curse of Ham argument that was in Genesis, that Noah's sons, one of Noah's sons was punished for his impudence, and his descendants would then be servants to the other brothers, Shem and Japheth. And so this was seen as biblical sanction for perpetual servitude of the African race. It doesn't mention race here, but metaphorically, the descendants of Noah were considered in terms of race, the black race and white race and Asians. So those, the Bible was widely invoked. One thinks of Romans 13, the powers that be are ordained of God. So part of Lincoln's wisdom consists in his ability to fight this battle on its own grounds, right? To invoke the Bible against the slaveholders. What I find very telling is that Lincoln likened pro-slavery interpretations of the Bible to Satan's manipulation of the Torah to Jesus in the temptation of Christ, as related in Matthew 4, where Christ goes into the desert and Satan tempts him, and Satan quotes the Bible to Jesus. And so Lincoln says that Southern ministers are doing essentially the same thing.